It's the afternoon of December 14th, 2009. I'm Michael Aron for the Rutgers program on the governor. We are in Newark at the law offices of the firm Gibbons to talk to former Chief Justice Jim Zazzali. Justice Zazzali goes back into the Essex County Prosecutor's Office with Brendan Byrne, helped him get elected in '73. Was counsel to the Sports Authority at some point in the Byrne administration, and became Attorney General at the very end of Brendan Byrne's second term. When did you first become aware of Brendan Byrne? Do you recall?
I do. It's something that kind of sticks in the memory. I was out of Georgetown one year, and my best friend who was at Georgetown with me lived down the street on Eastern Parkway in Newark. And we were visiting him over Thanksgiving, and it was about that time that Brendan Byrne had been named county prosecutor. I think it was 1959, or maybe fall '58, whatever. I remember Bob, my friend, who later went on, Bob O'Driscoll, became senior vice president of St. Barnabas Medical Center, said that his father, who was a stationary engineer, ran boilers in hospitals, an Irish immigrant, wonderful man, said to Bob when Brendan was appointed, he says, that kid is going to go places, meaning Brendan. And the Brendan Byrne meant nothing to me. Bob could have mentioned Mike Aron and it would have meant nothing, but I ignored that. Didn't resonate with me at all, but it's funny that his father had this augury or premonition of greatness, and I think it came to fruition. And then it wasn't, then I went to law school and came back to from D.C. to Jersey, and that's when I reconnected for the first time with Brendan Byrne.
How?
Well, I clerked for the late wonderful Judge Whipple. He very much wanted me to be an assistant prosecutor because of the great experience.
What level court was he?
He was the Superior Court Law Division at the time. It was before he was named a federal judge. And I said I did not want to go into the prosecutor's office. I had no interest in the criminal law. I wanted to be a labor lawyer, join my father. My brother was an assistant prosecutor in the office at the time. And to make a long story short, I finished the clerkship, and in the meantime, Judge Whipple, bless his soul, was working his mischief, and he had spoken with Judge Waugh, the assignment judge. I think it was I know it was Judge Waugh, and next minute, next thing I knew was November of 1965 when I got a call from Brendan Byrne's secretary. Mind you, not Brendan Byrne. So that was sort of a premonition of how he worked, saying, come up for an interview. And I said, for what? She said, for possible assistant prosecutor job. So I groaned because I really was not interested in doing it. And I sat down with him, and I told the story at my swearing in. For the entire 15-minute interview, he was seated behind his desk, shining his shoes, shining his loafers, never once looking up, as I recall. I don't think I ever made eye contact with him. And he asked me questions about this and that, what I was doing, Georgetown law, and I know I looked pretty young at the time, but he finally looked up after 15 minutes for the first time. He says, all right, you're hired, but it'll be a risk. Now, I told you about my mindset. I wanted this job about as much as I wanted to go to Mars, and so I fortunately had some sense of restraint, at least in those days, and said, okay, well, thank you very much, and then I was sworn in. It kind of gets worse because the next day, the Newark Evening News, now defunct, did a story, and in those days, being an assistant prosecutor was a pretty big thing. So, and again, my brother was there, and the title of the article was Brothers-in-Law, and announcing my appointment. But the article expressed Brendan's thinking, and I think he might admit to this. There were only like 18 assistant prosecutors in the office. Here he's hiring a second Zazzali, a brother. And he had to justify it somehow. And I have the clipping, and I recall basically what he said was that Governor, excuse the Freudian slip, Prosecutor Byrne indicated that he had searched widely in the city of Newark and the county of Essex for assistant prosecutors, but at the end of the day, he could get no one from any major firms, and instead he thus hired Nathan Cholodenko for $1 a year as a volunteer. Nate was a great old guy who was president of the Essex County Bar Association and agreed to work for $1 a year as a public service. And Zazzali. So as Judge Whipple's secretary said, boy, this is some article. It reads like Byrne scraped the bottom of the barrel. That was my connection.
What's your brother's name?
Andrew.
Your father was a labor lawyer in Newark?
Yep. And a general practitioner.
And did he found the firm, or did it go back before him?
No, he started up in the 1920s and had a nice little law practice, specialized in representing working people. Since you asked about that, I'll volunteer that he had his own career in public service. President Truman, I think you may know this.
I don't know this.
Well, it has a little bit of a history. In 1950, Dad was on the verge of nomination by President Truman as a federal judge in Newark. And in those days, that was indeed an honor, as it is today. There are only 4. I think there are 3 federal judges in the state, and Dad would have been the 4th, or certainly 4 in Newark. And it was all set. Dad had a great reputation, had a lot of support from the White House and people in Washington. But Jersey City and Hudson County prevailed, and they were the power, and they wanted a Jersey City guy, and they got a Jersey City guy, and that's life. To President Truman's credit, he then named my dad director of the Office of Price Stabilization, which was the Korean War successor to the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, during the Second World War, which administered wage and price controls, and you had ration stamps. You weren't even born then, Michael.
Yes, I was.
And then Dad passed away in '69, but at least he saw Andy and I functioning, I hope, reasonably well in the prosecutor's office.
Where'd you grow up?
In Newark, in the Vailsburg section of Newark.
Your mother, what did she do?
Born in Tuscany, between Florence and Siena, one of those beautiful little hill towns, and came to New York with her family and met my dad on the Bradley Beach boardwalk. She was a model, somehow. The classic immigrant story, you know, all those immigrant stories are great stories of courage and hopefully some success.
Just you and your brother, or any other sibling?
I have a sister who's a lifelong school teacher.
Did you always want to be a lawyer?
No. At Georgetown as an undergraduate, being pretty young, I just practiced avoidance for 4 years, and at the end of the 4th year said, what am I going to do, about a month before graduation? I just wouldn't think of it, of what my goal was. It was really avoidance to the extreme. But by then, between the nuns and the priests, diocesan priests and Jesuit priests, pounding into my head that this planet is all about doing good, I said, I'm going to be a doctor. That's what more good can you do than to administer to the sick and keep people healthy? The only catch was I had to have some facility with the sciences, or faculty for the sciences, and so I took a year of sciences after graduation and spent 6 months of that time cutting up a cat in comparative anatomy, which I actually enjoyed. The physics and the organic chemistry killed me, and I said, in the meantime, I had obtained, without seeking it, a scholarship from or fellowship from Georgetown's graduate school in history, and had forewent that in favor of the medical. So then it was a choice between going to graduate school or law school. I thought law school made the most sense, and reluctantly went to law school.
And why did you not want to be a prosecutor? Well,
I just had no interest in prosecuting criminals. To me, I thought that never really occurred to me. I thought that representing working men and women at a time when the labor movement really had a good deal more clout and influence than it does today was a pretty, frankly, a pretty noble career and a rewarding one, and I still feel that way.
so why did you accept Brendan Byrne's offer?
Because Judge Whipple, bless his soul, was really working on me for the experience. He said, you got to get that courtroom experience no matter what you do. And my father echoed that. As much as my dad wanted me to come with him, he thought the experience was good. And by the way, they were right and I was totally wrong, because the experience, having now said I never wanted to be a prosecutor, which was totally true, a wonderful 3 years because of the camaraderie, because of working for Brendan Byrne, the great people you worked with in that office,
Who?
and the experience.
Who did you work with?
Oh, Justin Walder, John Francis, my brother, Barry Evanchick, Richie McGlynn, Pete Murray, name long since gone, Van Clinton, and I'm missing some Dino Blioblius, names that became the great lawyers. Marty Greenberg, great names.
What kind of cases did you prosecute?
For the first year, I did everything from assault and battery on police officers to rape to homicide, and they were right. My dad and Judge Whipple were correct that you could not buy that experience. But I decided to do something different after the year. As much as I was enjoying the trial work, I thought I should switch to appeals and to learn how to write briefs, although I had some experience there, and orally argue matters. And I spent 2 years there, first for a year under Brendan, under Barry Evanchick, and then after Barry left, I took over as head of the appeals section, and I had the privilege of appearing before the New Jersey Supreme Court in that year about once a month.
How does arguing appeals differ from prosecuting criminals?
In a trial context, you don't have that on-the-ground excitement doing appeals, writing briefs, researching, arguing cases as you do in trying a case before 12 jurors. But it has its own set of satisfactions. More challenging to the extent once you get before the appellate division, consisting of 3 judges in those days, or the Supreme Court. Unlike a jury, which didn't talk back at you, these folks would talk back at you and question you vigorously, and that was terrific training. I recall my first argument. May I give you?
Sure.
First argument before the New Jersey Supreme Court. It was a case that I tried. I tried a homicide case where I got a conviction. I was concerned because of an error that I committed in my summation. I commented on the wife's failure to take the stand. It was arguably reversible error. And I went up, got on my feet for the first time before the court. Chief Justice Weintraub was the chief, and he was very demanding and a great Chief Justice. I started at 20 of 4, and at 4 o'clock he said, "Okay, counsel, we're going to stop for the day. I want you back here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to continue your argument." Well, I got in the car to drive back from Trenton to my home in Monmouth County, and was so bamboozled and flummoxed and preoccupied that as I was driving back to Monmouth County, I looked at these strange surroundings and realized that I was on my way to Pittsburgh on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So that was my exposure to the court.
One. What was Brendan Byrne like as a boss?
Hands off. You did your job. You were fine. He had very, very high standards. You never wanted to let him down. I think then I was just in my 20s. His presence, his seriousness, while it did not intimidate you, and certainly he never intended to intimidate anyone. He's was never that kind of a guy. But his presence kept you on your toes.
How much older was he than you?
I have to guess about then around 15 years older, I think.
Why'd you leave?
Well, Dad had a heart condition. I left in October of '68, and that November he had a near fatal heart attack. November of '68, and he died in '69. I just wanted to be with him for as long as I could, although I didn't think it would happen that quickly. It's one of my great regrets. I couldn't spend more time with Dad practicing, but I felt I should join him. I felt that I not only did I want to get into labor law, but I wanted to practice with him, but also to help him because of the serious heart condition.
Did your brother also go to the firm?
Andy stayed on. We felt both when Dad was ill and even after Dad died that as long as I was there, that would work, and Andy could stay. He loved it and stayed there actually a total of 9 years, and he was about to join me after Dad died. I'd say it was 1970 or so that I said, I need you. And at the same time, Joe Lordi, the then prosecutor, offered Andy the job of first assistant prosecutor, which was a significant accomplishment and a wonderful job. So I said, well, do it for a year or so. And then finally, I guess it was around 1971, I said, I need you. And he joined me. And
is he still practicing?
Oh, yeah, at age 78, he's stronger now and better now than ever. And other than Brendan Byrne and my father, I probably owe him as much as anyone.
How did you get introduced to politics?
Not at all until that '73 campaign when Brendan ran. I was in private practice. And then, not really. I did not, unfortunately, did not get very active in the campaign. But I think I probably gave a couple speeches, or maybe helped on research on an issue. He or someone, not he, but maybe someone on his campaign staff would ask me to analyze a question. I can recall. Let me step back. You're going back 35 years. I think it was Barry Evanchik, who was close to Brendan and then in private practice, was asked by someone to do some research as to the major cases in Brendan's office and Brendan's tenure. Barry could not do it, and so he asked me if I would do it. It just took a day or two to spend up time, looking at matters of public record concerning Brendan's career, his major cases, any potential problems. I didn't see any. And I think I gave a short memo to that effect.
Had you had much contact with him from the time you left the prosecutor's office
No.
to the '73 campaign?
No.
Any?
Oh, I had contact, but that contact was like maybe once a year. It's been an interesting relationship, at least until more recently, when I see him a little bit more. All through those years, let's see, I left the office in '68. He left the office in '67. I left the office until '68. In those intervening 5 or 6 years, maybe see him socially once or twice a year. I don't know. Your records may show more. I don't. So it was. He did attend my wedding, though.
When did you get married?
Shortly after the Civil War. Don't tell my wife I said that. It seems that. No, we're happily married 42 years. We were married.
Your wife, Eileen.
Yeah, very good. It was her birthday yesterday. And we were married in October '67 in New York.
And he attended the wedding.
And he and Jean attended the wedding.
Something pulled you toward the campaign. You say you did this sort of dossier on his record as a
Right.
prosecutor. Was it something you wanted to get involved with?
Well, I think, yeah, it was certainly, I wanted to, everyone who ever worked in that office wanted to see him elected governor.
Was it something you had thought about happening when you were in that office, or was it
No.
more of a surprise?
Well, that's a very good question. Let's step back. As evidenced by Dr. O'Driscoll's father's comment, people recognized that Brendan had a future, and I'm sure that anybody that was reading newspapers in those days realized that Brendan did have a future. What turn it would take, we did not know. Then he went on to the BPU, of course, as you all know, then the bench, and it looked like the judiciary might be his career. And I suppose as he continued with his judicial career, even though it was not that lengthy, it seemed that politics was probably vanishing. And then along came 1973, and he was plucked.
Who do you think he was plucked by?
I think there was a groundswell. Oh boy, again, not having been in politics, what I knew about politics, I basically knew from reading books and newspapers. I think that there was a groundswell for an attractive alternative candidate to that primary field. Although, as I recall, there were a couple good people in that field. And the reason I use groundswell is that I recall so vividly the morning after he announced his candidacy, which I think, and you would have to confirm, it was in March or April of '73. And I was on a way to a meeting in Camden County. I stopped at that, I think it's called Mom's Kitchen, at the intersection of Route 33. Not that you need to know all this, and Turnpike exit 8, I think it is, in Heightstown. A famous restaurant there, and I was having a cup of coffee, reading the Times, reporting on the first page of Brendan's entry into the race. And I remember the phrase that Brendan Byrne, quote, who looks like someone out of central casting in Hollywood, close quote, describing his great presence, fine looks, physical stature, Princeton and Harvard background, lovely wife, 7 kids, Irish Catholic, clean as a whistle, and then some, we all know that, with an impeccable reputation. So it was such an obvious thing. And I'm sure there were county leaders who gravitated towards him. Don't ask me who they were. I mean, they had to be foolish not to. And in fact, maybe it was, when I say he was plucked, when he announced, now who the immediate catalysts were, I don't know. You'd have to go back to the newspapers. But my recollection is that other county chairs, a fellow in Mercer, I forget his name.
Dick Coffey.
Right. And half a dozen others immediately dropped the candidates they were supporting and all gravitated to Brendan.
Did he have great physical presence?
I think so. I think he did. Sure, his speaking style was not stentorian. He was no Clarence Darrow, but he got the job done.
You say that you really weren't involved in politics, but your father was in the Truman administration. Did your father steer you toward the political realm, or introduce you to political people?
Very, very good question. Again, I'm not just saying that because Dad spoke to me twice about politics and said, "Don't go into it, son." Twice before he died. I found that interesting. I think Dad, though not a politician, had seen how tough it was in those days. But I never asked him why, and I've often been curious as to why he gave me that advice. I think it was wonderful advice, and I'm glad I never did do it. And I'm not speaking pejoratively. I think
you were in the political...
Well, I'm talking about
world.
elective office. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. And I'm making that. I think it's a distinction with a difference, and I'm not speaking pejoratively of elective office. That's for sure. You need good people there, but I think maybe he felt perhaps I was too sensitive to go into it. That you could easily get ensnared, even though you're innocent of wrongdoing or whatever. But surely I was familiar with the political scene, and as I said, in that election, there were a few things I was called upon to do, including I think I gave a couple of speeches. Don't remember.
What kind of groups would you have been asked to speak
I think
before?
young lawyers, bar association folks, a couple, the building trades convention in Atlantic City was one. There were maybe 3-4 talks that I gave.
Building trades because you were a labor
Right.
lawyer.
Oh, exactly. Exactly.
Do you recall who your main contact in the campaign was?
The relationship was so attenuated that I'm not sure who it was, but if I reached out for anyone, it was probably a Luke Hayden. That, I think, was the prime, because he and Leon, I think, were managing the campaign in very general terms.
What are your recollections of those two?
I think extraordinarily talented, and I know it was a controversial 4 years. Well, Lou was there for about 2.5 years, but again, you remember certain phrases. I remember when Lou left in '76 or so, and the press described him as the glue that held the administration together. He was and is an immensely talented person, as was Leon, as were so many people that Brendan attracted to office in those days.
I'm told that Caden was also a labor lawyer, is that?
He, after Harvard, he worked in Ted Keel's office. Ted Keel was a famous mediator and troubleshooter, not only in New York, but throughout the country. And he worked in Keel's office doing labor law. And I think before or after that, he worked for Bobby Kennedy as well.
How about you? What in the area of labor law stands out as the high point or high points of your years as a labor lawyer?
I never had that put to me before. I think it's more of a, here I am talking as a lawyer or a judge, a totality of the circumstances consideration. I always enjoyed representing some poor fellow or man or woman who was unfairly discharged, as often as not before, because of union activity, and trying to get that person his or her job back before the National Labor Relations Board down the street or before an arbitrator or whomever. I've always gotten a kick out of that, because biased as I am, as I admitted, most of the time I think the employers were just plain wrong, and were as a moral principle and well, they were violating basic moral and legal code. And I also used to get a kick out of negotiating contracts for workers. But I think you know this. I've always believed in the value of the trade union movement with all of its warts. All you have to do is pick up, which I finally got around to 2 weeks ago, Grapes of Wrath, to see, and that's not well. That's part of the society that we still have around here, because it's funny, isn't it, that and I'm only a short ways into Grapes of Wrath, but the first 50 pages really rail against the banks. Rail against the banks. I don't know French, but I know the phrase, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, etc., etc., etc. And I'll let today's headlines speak for themselves on that issue.
Or
Or an article that was appeared in this week's America magazine, the great weekly publication on current events of the Jesuit order. A major article on repudiating the School of Economics, which is still very popular, that greed is good.
Excuse me.
The article by a prominent economist, just to repeat, repudiates correctly the School of Economics, which has been preaching for some time now that greed is somehow good. Greed is bad. Excessive greed is outrageous, and we're seeing a lot of it.
What did you do after Brendan Byrne got elected in connection with the Byrne administration?
I'd seen a couple, one or two references in the newspaper about me. One of them, I think, had me mentioned for Commissioner of Labor, which was logical on one hand, but I was, I think, frightened silly at the thought, never having been in that kind of public service, except for being an assistant prosecutor, which is just lawyering, but to head up an agency, and never heard anything more about it, and I was delighted. Went to Joel Jacobson, and then I figured that was it. And certainly...
Good. Oh, Joe Hoffman. It was Joe Hoffman, says Don.
Was Joe Hoffman the first? Well, I know that Joe Hoffman ran against Brendan in the primary. You know what? You're absolutely right. Jacobson was considered for Commissioner of Labor, then did something else. So I think he was maybe Energy Commissioner. He served in Brendan's cabinet later on, but I think there was fierce resistance, and we all know the classic historical split between the building trades on the one hand, and the industrial unions on the other. And I think the industrial unions wanted Joel, and I suspect there was resistance within the trade union movement. He was a good guy. In any event, he didn't go to me, and I was happy, and nothing happened, and I didn't expect anything to happen, and I'm pleased to say he never suggested that anything happened to me. But around the holidays that year is when Byrne called me down to the transition office and asked me to, with my brother, it was just two of us then, to be general counsel to the Sports Authority.
Why the Sports Authority?
Go back to just about the time of the election itself in early November. I think it was about a week or 10 days before the election, and there was an event in Monmouth County. Again, I wasn't doing too much, except there was an event in Monmouth County down the street, so I went to some fundraiser for Byrne, and there were a couple hundred people who were there. I never saw the governor, but Luke Hayden came up to me and says, the governor wants you to do a paper on the sports complex. I have to confess now that I didn't know what the sports complex was, because I'm not a sports nut, largely because I was an asthmatic and never played anything, although going back to my dad, as I think you may know, he was a star athlete at Georgetown, won 12 letters there, and was the first one named to their Hall of Fame when they established it about 50 years ago.
Did not know that.
Yeah, he was here at St. Benedict's, 12 letters here. Baseball, basketball, football for 4 years, and then being one of 11 kids, that was the only way he was going to go to Georgetown on a scholarship. So they invited him down, and he did 12 letters there, pitched a couple of no-hitters, was invited to pitch for Cincinnati, go to the Reds after graduation, turned that down to go to law school. But he was also, his great sport was actually basketball, where he was captain of the basketball team during its record undefeated home season. They won like 48 games at home over 2 years when he was captain. I once saw John Thompson Sr. At a dinner. I sat next to him. I told Thompson that story just to break the ice and make conversation. And don't mind saying it, when I told Thompson about my dad captaining that team for 2 undefeated seasons, John Thompson turned away from me and never spoke to me for the rest of the evening. So go figure. The son is more personable.
He was jealous?
Who knows? Who knows? But how did I get onto...
I don't know how we got there. The sports complex, and you were not.
Yeah, I didn't know what the sports complex was. Well, I did some research, and then he said the governor wants a paper from you, telling him all the facts, like a brief, and whether it was a good idea or not a good idea. Now, I was not gospel. This was not. I was not making that decision, obviously, as to whether to go or not go. I should be more specific. The question was, should the governor support the moral pledge? The moral pledge was short of an absolute guarantee by the state that the bonds would be honored. It's kind of an arcane concept, but some states, some public entities who do not want to pledge the full faith and credit of the state or the governmental entity for the bonds, for whatever reasons, take the next step and give a moral pledge, which is if we default on the bonds, the state treasury will make it up, et cetera, and no legal obligation, but a moral obligation. And so I did a 30-page analysis, and I have it. You know, I'm surprised that you haven't found that. That's there somewhere. Because the only noteworthy, I worked on it for 2 weeks. My brother helped. The only noteworthy part of it I remember is that at the end I said, we really should have a baseball stadium up there because I loved baseball at least. That's the one sport I didn't know. And B, I remember my closing line after going through this convoluted discussion of moral pledge and the rest of it, and confusing even myself, I closed out by saying, tennis, anyone? Knowing that tennis was the governor's sport. And there we are.
Were you at Byrne headquarters on election night in '73, do you recall?
Probably, I don't remember. I'm embarrassed to say. I probably was, though. I probably was.
You referred to the traditional disputes between the building trades and the industrial unions. Where does that spring from? Why is that?
I don't know my labor history well enough, and I should know because that's a pretty simple answer. I don't think that it's because of jurisdictional disputes between the two. If anything, it's the jurisdictional disputes between and among building trades that are the problem, not with the industrial trades. The bricklayers and plumbers aren't fighting with the lady garment workers generally. Maybe because one or the other had thought of themselves as the original labor movement. Sam Gompers being allegedly the founder of the modern trade union movement, I think he was out of the industrial unions. Again, I'm coming up short on this because I haven't read in the area in a long time, and my memory is escaping me. As often happens, maybe a certain amount of rivalry between the two, not jealousy, personalities. What can I tell you?
It still exists?
No, unfortunately, because I think it's in large measure due to the reduction of the industrial union movement, with first all of the manufacturing work, or so much of it, going south, like textile work, and then far worse, leaving the country altogether. So the international lady garment workers, the auto workers, the steel workers, these are great trades with splendid traditions. Did an awful lot of good for tens of millions of people and their families, and we go back to what I was talking about before, as have the building trades. So the industrial unions have not been the power in the last 30 years that they were back when the labor movement represented according to FDR, represented 1/3 of the workers in America. That's when he got up at some rally and said, if I were an American worker, I would join a union. I never quite pictured Reagan or Bush saying that.
Who were the key New Jersey labor leaders at that time?
Oh, I have my own particular favorites. The head of the laborers union, the heavy and highway laborers union, and that's an important distinction, was Jim Carroll, a reformer, now dead. His son was Bobby Carroll, who later went on to be the director of the organized crime section for the Division of Criminal Justice under Ed Steer, and he had a long and distinguished career fighting organized crime. And his father was a splendid labor leader. George Laufenberg of the Carpenters, who was just a wonderful guy, whose son is still very active with the Carpenters, running their health and pension funds. Those are Joe Madden, who was Carroll's predecessor, who was a legend in the 50s and the 60s, helped make Dick Hughes governor, and Hughes would acknowledge that.
When I came to New Jersey in the late 70s, we were reading and writing articles about feuds between Charlie Marciani of the AFL-CIO and Jimmy Grogan of the building trades.
That brings back memories, and that was fierce. And that's interesting because they were both building trades guys. Marciani with the electricians and Grogan with the whatever it was.
Do you know that New Jersey was the last state to merge its AFL and its CIO?
Doesn't surprise me because the split was especially bad here. It's a shame, but who knows?
So the governor asked you and your brother to be the counsel to the Sports Authority, in part because you had researched this issue about the bonds and the moral pledge. Is it odd that he would pick a pair of labor lawyers to be the counsel to a state authority?
I don't know if it was odd. All I can tell you, and I think he would confirm this, is that I said no when he first asked me.
Why?
I felt we were just two lawyers, and we were replacing a major firm, which no need to get into that, a very fine firm of 50 or 60 lawyers.
That Cahill had put there?
Yeah, and I think Brendan had enough confidence in us as lawyers. I did do other things besides labor, for example, the prosecutor's office, and had a general practice at the time. But I still felt that was a Herculean task confronting us, and so we went back and forth, and I didn't want to be disrespectful, but I told him all these reasons, and he prevailed at the end of a fairly lengthy discussion. I wasn't being a prima donna about it. It was I went home and told Andy with mixed emotions. I said, "This is great, but how are we going to do this?" Well, you hire people. That reminds me, if I may, the
Please.
second, in fact, in those days, in '74, the sports complex met in this building in One Gateway Center, because ground had not been broken up in East Rutherford, and hence the board settled on this location. In the beginning, Sonny Warblin, of course, was the legendary chairman, and really helped to make the sports complex what it was. He was seated at the one end of the table as I went to my first couple of meetings, and you had 3 or 4, well, you had a total of 7 commissioners, and I was at the far end. And it's no secret, those first couple of meetings in March, April of that year, I was uncomfortable because I could see that folks were not comfortable with me. It was the ancien regime, the old guard, good people, but all Cahill appointees, seeing this newcomer, the new general counsel, and that was kind of augury of things to come, because Brendan wanted a number of his people there, and I think his reasoning was pretty simple. This was a large risk. That's when we talk about the moral pledge. And by the way, parenthetically, one of Brendan's great accomplishments, and he deserves the credit for it, along with Bill Cahill. But Brendan had to make that terrible decision about endorsing a moral pledge and coming up to the plate. In the meantime, Governor Rockefeller is over there in New York saying he's going to build a stadium and committing hundreds of millions of dollars to a stadium over there, a giant stadium, to cut the legs out from under New Jersey. Again, no secret. Well, so clearly there was resentment, not hostility. At the end of the meeting, about the third meeting, I went up to the then Secretary Treasurer, whom I knew, a lawyer, and I said to him, let's call him Charlie, why the resentment? And he did know that I did not seek this position. He said, I know that. In fact, I turned Brendan down. He says, I know that. Why the resentment? And Charlie looked at me and said, Jimmy, how many lawyers are you in your firm? And with total sincerity, I said 2, but we're going to 3 in the fall. And I think Charlie thought I was being a wise guy. When I was perfectly sincere, to me, that was a 50% quantum leap. The great thing was, and I give my brother credit for this, that within a year or so, and for the next 8 years, we were there for the 3 years of construction and the first 5 years of operation. Not only was it a great success, I think, as everyone recognizes in those years, probably the premier sports authority or complex in the world at that time. That's what often critics would say about it. We developed a great relationship with Werblin, with the commissioners, and we really produced, and my brother especially, and I think they were more than satisfied.
So you were...
Werblin and I became great friends as years went on.
What was he like, Sonny Werblin?
Very demanding, but always professional, always courteous, an obsessive-compulsive personality about cleanliness and doing things first class and the right way. And I make those comments as compliments about him.
A perfectionist?
Yeah, a perfectionist is good. The only tension we had, which he always, it wasn't tension because, as I say, we really developed a significant rapport. He understandably felt that this thing was a risk, and the only way we were going to succeed is to run it as a business. Now, that was an inevitable, but running it as a business without any government strictures is inherently inherently conflicts with the fact that we were a public authority established by statute, subject to all kinds of regulatory agencies and the statute itself, the Open Public Meetings Law, the requirement of minutes, the Sunshine Law requirements, and on and on and on. So that while Sonny, bless his soul, wanted to run it as a business, it would create problems when, well, we have to reflect this in the minutes. It has to be open government. And I could understand his frustration. But, with his leadership and Brendan's support, it became a great institution for decades.
Did you have any contact with the Mara family?
We initially had that contract, and Brendan would be a great source for this. Right after the election, but before the inauguration, in November and December, when we met at, I think, the Harvard Club in New York to negotiate, renegotiate the lease. It was Brendan himself, Bob Del Tufo, myself, maybe Dick Leone, probably Caden, 5 or 6 of us negotiating with Wellington Mara, his son-in-law, a lawyer, Ray Walsh, a very fine man, and the Giants team. Again, this is all subject to Brendan's recollection, but I think the governor was concerned that in an understandable effort to get the Giants over here, and that was no mean feat and a terrific accomplishment by Cahill, his folks, and Werberlin this is in 71, 72, that while they didn't give away the store, they had to make significant concessions. That's the negotiation process. And but for those concessions, Wellington et al.'s were not going to come over. Again, I'm going back 38 years. Brendan, conversely, not this is my characterization, okay, not his, but didn't want a sweetheart contract. So Brendan, with his underestimated but very significant negotiating skills, together with the others I've mentioned, were able to renegotiate a contract that was more fair to the state.
You were
I did not get the one thing that I wanted, which was a commitment that they'd eventually change their name to the New Jersey Giants. That did not happen, but that was my goal. Did
Brendan want that too?
I'm sure he would have liked it, but Brendan was always more realistic and sensible than I, and that was probably Pollyanna thinking on my part. But it should have been, and it should be that today.
You think so?
I certainly do, just as like I think they should revise their positions concerning the amounts of monies that they're charging for licensed seats.
So you were counsel to the Sports Authority through both Byrne terms? Is that what
Yes.
you were saying? The entire time until you were named Attorney General?
Correct.
So who succeeded Sonny Werblin as chairman of the Sports
Bill Highland,
Uh-huh.
who did a masterful job as well, kept the tradition going.
And did Highland stay on for the remainder of your time there, or did somebody else come in as
Yes,
chairman?
Bill was there, as I recall, until the end. Sonny left to go over to Madison Square Garden, to run Madison Square Garden, probably about somewhere around 1977, 78, I think. Maybe before.
Brendan Byrne, while you were counsel of the Sports Authority, was enacting a lot of legislation and instituting a lot of reforms in a lot of areas, and had a rough re-election ride in the interim. Among the accomplishments outside of the Sports Authority, what do you remember most about the Brendan Byrne years?
Well, first, what I remember, then remember most, his individual accomplishments. I mean, they're legion, but the Pinelands, of course, the Sports Authority, the establishment it's an arcane subject. We're critical of the administrative code and the administrative law judges to maximize the level of justice and the quantity and the quality of justice that we afford to our citizens. Atlantic City, and a number of others, but you asked what was most significant. I think what he brought to the table was first, it's an overworked word, but it's still valid, of course, integrity. That he just had enormous integrity, and you knew that, and you knew that there was honesty in state government. Not that it wasn't there before. Governor Cahill and Governor Hughes, other two governors I know, were both equally honest men individually. Brendan, I think, brought the concept of clean government to new heights. His courage along with that. We've had, I think all of our governors have demonstrated courage many times in their careers. I think Brendan was demonstrated a unique brand of courage because, well, ask people who were close to him during those years that he, when told that a particular stand on a particular issue, and there was more than one, could cost him the re-election, he would say, so what? We'll do it anyway, or words to that effect.
Did you think
just to stay with that for a moment, if I may, and he has said, and it was true, that he always felt that any person who runs for major office should be willing to lose an election for at least one issue that he or she has identified, preferably more, but at least one. You should be willing to say, this is my stand on this issue. I know it's unpopular, and it may lose me the election, but I nonetheless take this position. That's courage and intellectual honesty. Along with that, he managed to, as he's fond of saying, I'm sure you've heard this from him many times, attract some terrific people, many terrific people. I've already identified a couple of them, but go on to a Degnan, a Highland, a Lou Gambaccini, Commissioner of Transportation, a Dan O'Hearn, who just passed away, who was Commissioner of Environmental Protection, and on and on and on. He was known for his exceptional ability to attract people. You know, as I think about it, that had its genesis probably back when he was prosecutor, because we all know what a mecca the United States Attorney's Office is, for good reason. Any young lawyer flows to the mecca of law enforcement, the Justice Department, for a job. That's true today, was true then, and for very good reason. It's a wonderful position. In those days, however, you had a number of assistant U.S. attorneys leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office, and it was a fine office, to come up and work for Brendan Byrne. And
that's the prosecutor's office or as governor?
No, in the prosecutor's office. They left the U.S. Attorney's Office to go to work in the prosecutor's office for lesser pay, although in those days you could work part-time as an assistant prosecutor in the private practice of law. But the real reason for the change is they wanted to work for Brendan Byrne, and he brought that same magnet, that personal magnet and magnetism to him, charismatic or not, to the State House by drawing great people. Combined with what I've just said, he will tell you that, I think he will, that he felt his most important responsibility, or among his most important responsibilities, was the appointment of quality judges and prosecutors. And he took that very, very seriously, often interviewing judges, prospective judges and prosecutors. And I'm not just talking about justices. I'm talking about rank-and-file judges, so to speak, rank-and-file, and would interview them. And in the aggregate, he was just, those are the things I remember the most.
Do you recall in '77 whether you thought he could be reelected or not?
I did. I felt that there weren't too many. Just bear with me. I just wanted to.
77.
In terms of the individual integrity too, and I think this is true of all of our governors. I can only speak about Brendan, or at least primarily about him. When I was Attorney General, never once a question about the operation of the office, what I was doing, why I was doing things. You know, never natural and inquiries that may have been natural and normal. He just maintained a completely hands-off policy towards the Attorney General so that you could function as you must function, with independence in that job.
Did you think he could be reelected early on in 1977?
Or early on was when, what was the figure in February of that year, that he had an approval rating of about 17%, somewhere thereabouts. I thought he could, that it would be an uphill battle. There were a few people who thought it could happen. Was I confident it would happen? No, but I thought he could.
Did he talk about it to you, do you recall?
I think once he did ask me, when I bumped into him, probably at about that low period. And without being Pollyanna, to use the word I used before, I was somewhat positive or optimistic. I thought I could do it.
Was it all the income tax? Was that what it was?
I think it was, and yeah, on reflection, going back to the sports complex, and your records may show this, when it opened, that was the formal dedication of the racetrack. The booing and worse that occurred at the racetrack was just astonishing. I was there, I mean, because I was counsel of the sports complex. My wife was there, and talking to Jean afterwards, Jean Byrne, she was in physical fear the crowd was so vicious.
Hmm.
And that was symptom, I guess, of what was going on within the state. But people, right reason prevailed.
After it did, was there any talk of you going into the administration at that point?
It was in the transition for that second term, late 1977, Bill Highland resigned to go into private practice, and there were 6 or 7 names mentioned for replacement, and I, among a number of other names you would recognize, was one of the main named. I did not think that would happen, and it did not, and it went to John Degnan, and that was a great choice.
Did you have any role in the transition? I guess it's.
I think I was a transition person for either the Department of Law and Public Safety or the Department of Labor, as I recall.
But you stayed. Your connection to the administration stayed as counsel to the Sports Authority.
Yes.
But you did then subsequently become Attorney General. Tell us that story.
It was early '81. Dan O'Hearn was counsel to the governor, bless his soul, again, a great man. Called me, and I knew Dan reasonably well even then. And he just didn't call casually, but he called about the weather or something or other. And he said, so there's a rumor around here you're going to be Attorney General. And again, it was sincere for various personal reasons. And my family life was fine. I was just sort of, at that point, a little fed up with the practice of law for a number of reasons. Not fed up, but disappointed. And I think I wanted to go out and teach Latin or English somewhere. And I said, I want no part of it, Dan. I know you're joking, but I said, I don't want to. Well, and then he walked away from it. Now, I've often wondered, and I never asked Dan or the governor, was he an emissary from the governor? I don't know. Was he just making conversation because he had heard it? And that was that. And then a month later, Degnan resigned to run for governor. And I'm a swimmer, or at least because of my asthma, I had to do something. And I've always found swimming to be the best tonic in the world. It's better than 14 cups of coffee. And I'd gone up the street here to the Y that afternoon. It was a Friday afternoon around 1 o'clock to go for a swim, came back. It was around 2 o'clock because I remember the time. And Brendan Byrne called and says, how would you like to succeed? No, he said, how would you like to succeed Degnan? I hear you're not interested. Would you like to do it? And I told him, yeah, you bet I would. I surprised myself. I think I had kind of overcome my disappointments in that prior month or two about the practice of law. But I was really all worked up because of the swim. That swim made a difference in my career, and I was raring to do anything. Just the adrenaline was pumping. So I said, sure. And he said, well, come on down, we'll talk about it. And the rest, as they say, is history.
What did you do after getting that offer to become the new Attorney General?
You mean in the job itself?
Well, did you discuss what the job entailed with
I
John Degnan, with others who had held the job before Bill Highland?
Oh, sure, but in terms, I didn't do anything to make up my mind. I decided this is one offer I would accept. And I did speak with Highland and Degnan about the job, and I actually left, even though my swearing in wasn't for about a month later. I knew that I had a lot of catching up to do, so I just went down and planted myself in the AG's office, in a small office, while there was an acting Attorney General for about 3 weeks, and just learned as much as I could about the job. And so it's a cliche, but I wanted to hit the ground running.
What surprised you about the job that you didn't expect from the outside?
What surprised me is what my colleagues and friends and lawyers told me that surprised them, and they were really kind of wondering and worrying whether, since I had more of a, for lack of a better word, contemplative nature. You may not think that way, Don, but I did feel that, and they felt that I would just agonize and worry about every decision and nothing would get done. Well, it did not take me more than a nanosecond to realize that if I was truly going to accomplish something, I just had to take all the information I could get on an issue, assimilate it as quickly as possible, make a decision, and then implement it. And that surprised me and everyone that I'm close to, that I was able to do that. And then not worry and go on to the next decision 2 hours or 2 days later.
What were some of the key matters or issues that you dealt with during those months as Attorney General?
Well, it was a great year. I think that I'd have to go back to 27 years to my files, but I remember going on board, and I know this is today a controversial issue in this state. I nonetheless said at the kitchen table one day to my wife before being sworn in that I felt the drinking age should increase, that the carnage on our roads to our kids, to our teenagers, particularly in that 18, 19, 20-year-old bracket, was just enormous. I raised the issue with staff. They said it needed legislation. I said, I know that study commissions are often a way to avoid something, because a study commission studies something to death, issues a report, and then it goes on a shelf ad infinitum. No one ever does anything about it. But I knew that I did have to have a study commission, but I wanted to be effective. And I gave them their mandate, and they came out with the report. And it was, I pushed them. I was meeting with some resistance about the concept, but they eventually, though I gave them free rein, they voted to recommend the increase, and I made it my recommendation, submitted it the day before I left office, and 6 months later it was enacted, and the New York Times, in a front page story, said it was my staff's efforts that brought that about. But there were other things dealing with, well, because it was so close to home, going after, there was a questionable union in Atlantic City at the time, and I'm being polite and understated when I say a questionable union, that had too much power and was a threat to the integrity of the casino experiment, I will call it. It was an unprecedented effort, but we filed an action against that union to enjoin the officers of that union from holding office on the basis that it violated the Casino Control Act because of their backgrounds. We'll leave it at that. And amidst much skepticism on the one hand and criticism on the other, we succeeded. Skepticism because it was felt that the courts would not uphold this effort. I thought that at the end of the day I would win somewhere along the line with finality, and we did. And criticism because, as a labor person, still, then and now committed to the trade union movement, it was perceived by some narrow minds, if I can say that, as being a betrayal of the movement. I didn't see it that way at all, but I did meet with criticism there. Also worked in areas, I certainly did the basic stuff, the crime on the street problems, the organized crime issues, the casino threats, et cetera, et cetera. We focused on all of that, but I felt that the job was more than a Dick Tracy job. It was more than law enforcement, and it is. Because besides the Division of Criminal Justice, we had then 400 or 500 attorneys doing the work of defending the state and pursuing matters on behalf of the state.
Skipping back a little bit, let me push you to the initial Atlantic City casino referendums. Brendan Byrne came out for the second one, which restricted casino gambling to Atlantic City, the first one was more of a broad-based referendum that was defeated. How did you feel personally about casino gambling in New Jersey?
My own reaction was, wow, you're going back a long time. I think one basic reaction was one of indifference with a tilt towards who needs it. Wasn't crazy about it, but I think time vindicated the decision. It's done a lot for that area of the state.
In fact, Dick Leone as state treasurer and Bill Highland as attorney general opposed casino gambling, and in other interviews we've heard that they offered to resign because they felt so strongly about it, but Governor Byrne rejected their resignation.
I did not know that. I think, you know, a couple of other, I mean, just pet projects. I felt very strongly about the problem of migrant workers in the southern part of the state, and the use of sweatshops in the northern part of the state, particularly in the northeastern counties like Passaic, Hudson, etc. And we initiated significant efforts to address those problems. Those are interesting stories, but time won't allow going into them.
Another responsibility you take on after Dan O'Hearn is appointed to the Supreme Court from his position as counsel is to take over the job of vetting judicial and prosecutorial appointments. Discuss that.
It was an interesting experience to undertake that, to realize how important that issue was to Governor Byrne, and to make sure that your efforts reflected his interest in making sure that he had the best possible people there. I stayed away from the politics of that process, and politics does touch on those appointments, at least in some cases. And my function was more one of quality control. But you certainly became aware why he felt that this issue was among his priorities, as I said a while back. It's so important. I mean, the administration of justice and making sure that our almost 10 million citizens are treated fairly is not going to happen unless you have quality people there as judges and as prosecutors, particularly judges. And the judiciary of New Jersey still enjoys a great reputation, not exclusively because, but in large measure, I think, because of the steps he took to start that process rolling with a meaningful review process within the governor's office of judges.
Of course, you come into the administration in its last year when many people who had been there in earlier years are sort of planning their next career move. Did that cause any frustration in the sense that some people were looking to the next step, and you're coming in trying to make your mark with the time that you have as Attorney General?
Yeah, I suppose there was an element of making your mark, and this ties in with it. It was really, I hope to think a little bit more of trying to just do a little bit of good without sounding like a Boy Scout, or I'll use the word again, to reflect what a Brendan Byrne stood for. Now, having said that, it's funny, Don, you asked that because I was just at a small dinner for John Farmer, who just retired as the editorial page editor of the Ledger, and he at that time, in fact, he and I came into the Byrne administration at about the same time. John came in as public information officer, and I reminisced. I said, John, do you remember that at the end, after the election, as we're getting close to when Kane was replacing Brendan and Kimmelman was replacing me, do you remember coming up to me in January and tapping me on the shoulder and saying to me, General, the press corps wants you to know it's over. That this is over. If someone said the only guy who doesn't understand that it's all over is Zazzali. And that I knew it was over, but I still wanted to work until the end, for example, on that number of projects, including the increase in the drinking age project. So it was fun.
I think we're going to have to break for today, but hope to continue at some future date.
I must say this. I think that there were 8 wonderful years for this state when Brendan was governor. But if I had my druthers, I'm happy that I was there towards the end of his 8 years. He was great to deal with. In the prosecutor's office, I always felt that he was the one who was more formal, etc., if you will. And but in that year, at the end, he was the one who was far more relaxed, and I was always on edge. Not with him, but just generally, because the pressure was on for the first real time in my life.